ADHD sent on, it says the outcome of this dude changed death penalty laws purely because of how botched it was. No NSFW imagery and 10 minutes.
On September 2nd, 1983, Jimmy Lee Gray faced execution by a cyanide gas chamber in Mississippi for
Cyanide gas chamber. Wait, what year was this? You said
1983. Jimmy Lee Gray faced execution by a cyanide gas chamber.
They had cyanide gas chambers in 1983.
Sodomizing and killing a 3-year-old girl. During that time, he was also on parole for a 20-year sentence for killing his girlfriend when he was 18 years old. Some consider his execution to be one of the most botched in U.S. history.
Is it true that the way they're doing it now with the injection is very painful too? It is, right? Didn't try it, no, but they probably know that by now. It can fail. Why don't they just shoot the people instead? I guess that can also fail technically, but...
Jimmy Lee Gray was born in Whittier, California, September 25th, 1949. He described himself as having a troubled childhood and coming from a broken home. Gray in his younger years had a reputation of being a loner and having a violent temper. In the fall of 1967, when he was 18, Gray had a dispute with his family and moved in with his girlfriend, Elda L. Prince, and her family in Parker, Arizona. They had welcomed him in and treated him as one of their own family members. On January 5th, 1968, Elda was supposed to leave school early for a doctor's appointment. When her mother, Opal Prince, went to pick her up at 4:30, a receptionist told her that Elda never showed up. Opal went home to see if her daughter took the school bus like usual, but the school bus arrived and left without Elda on it. Opal got worried and called the police to report her daughter missing. Gray went with Elda's family to the sheriff's office and even helped the sheriff and family look for Elda. While searching, the sheriff noticed that Gray's shoes seemed dirtied up from water and mud. He became suspicious and took Gray into questioning the next day. Gray eventually...
Do you guys know who this is? Or no? Is he famous? No?
eventually led them to her body.
That's kind of weird though, that you have muddied shoes and then they just take you in for questioning, right? But I mean, most of the time it is a family member, you know.
That was in a culvert near the Colorado River. His shoes matched the prints found at the scene of the crime. He had strangled Elda and sliced her throat. He met her after school, and as they were walking home, Elda made fun of his sexual impotence and he lost his temper. He was charged with second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, but was paroled only after 7. His trial judge disagreed with his parole and felt that he was still a dangerous person. Despite this, he was released. After his release, he moved to Mississippi, where he killed his second victim, 3-year-old Teresa Jean Scales. On June 25th, 1976, he lured Teresa to his apartment to play with kittens. He then kidnapped her, taking her to a remote location on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, 20 miles away from her home in Pascagoula. Her parents reported her missing around 5 p.m. Gray lived in the same apartment complex as her parents did, and was questioned by police after some neighbors said that they had seen Teresa with a man who lived in the apartment complex that had a red Volkswagen. When Gray returned to the apartment complex, police noticed the bottom of his pants were wet. He tried to tell them that he had been swimming in the complex's pool, but after more questioning and pressuring from police, he admitted that he had took Teresa for a ride to the countryside, and that he had touched the little girl. He also told them that she had wandered off on her own and fell into a shallow ditch. Then he rescued her from the ditch while she was still breathing and put her into the trunk of his car. He started home, and on the way, he stopped at
why the trunk? Why would you say that? I rescued her and put her in the trunk. Okay.
At a bridge over Black Creek, where he took Teresa from his trunk and threw her into the water. He led police to the location at 3:30 a.m. When Teresa was examined by a doctor, the doctor found that Teresa had been gagged with her own underwear, sodomized, and finally suffocated by being held face down in a ditch full of mud. These were Teresa's last moments.
Christ.
In his first trial in 1976,
This guy is an imbecile.
he was charged with first-degree murder and sodomy. It only took an hour for the jury to convict and sentence him to death by gas chamber. The Supreme Court reversed the verdict, and he got a new trial in 1978. This time he got to personally address the jury, but they were not convinced and felt the death penalty was justified. This would remain the verdict despite numerous appeals that would be made by Gray, his attorneys, and the reverends and chaplains he befriended while in the Mississippi State Penitentiary. They described him as being sensitive, shy, gentle, bright, and troubled. Reverend Joseph B. Ingle, who loved Gray as a brother, described him as being a devout Christian who had committed crimes, who was intensely aware of his responsibility of his actions, and sought help in getting the treatment he needed to keep himself from ever committing those actions again. A series of appeals delayed the execution for about 7 years. On the day of the execution, Gray's lawyers pleaded with the Supreme Court to delay the execution in order to file an appeal on 2 questions not previously discussed: Gray's sanity and whether the use of the gas chamber constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The lawyers from the Southern Poverty Law Center had argued that Mr. Gray was insane. They also mentioned that even after the first murder, Gray was never given any psychiatric evaluation to determine what kind of help he needed, or if he was even ready to be released. Gray and his lawyers wanted to change his death penalty to life in prison without parole. The governor of Mississippi at the time, William Winter, had 2 worries about this.
What's the difference?
First was that Gray had committed not 1, but 2 murders, and feared it could happen again. And the second reason, he worried that if he did change Gray's sentence to life without parole, a future governor might commute the sentence to life in prison with the possibility of parole. During Gray's trials, no members of his family came to speak against his death sentence. In a psychiatric report that was taken after Teresa's death, it showed that Gray was severely abused by his mother, Verna Smith, and had nothing short of hateful rage towards her. In 1977, Verna actually urged the state to kill her son. He had a phone call with her before his execution. His maternal grandma said, "I hold Jimmy's mother in the state of Arizona to be just as responsible as Jimmy." Richard Scales, Teresa's father, made the following remarks about Gray's execution: "I'm glad it's happening. It should have been done years ago. Even in prison, he had been able to talk, breathe, and laugh, and he had taken all these things away from my little girl. He didn't have the right to continue living." Opal Prince, the mother of Elda, hailed the day as our big day and said that his execution was overdue. "It should have been done in 1968 in Arizona," she said. "I know I come on hard, but this is a hard thing. With all the jail overcrowding, let's get rid of people like him and make room for the people who can be rehabilitated. I've put better dogs to sleep than that man," said Miss Prince, who was director of rabies and animal control in Mojave County. On September 2nd, 1983, a few hours before death, Gray was accompanied by Reverend Joseph B. Ingle and 5 other ministers who joined him for a last meal. Gray had a last meal of rice, enchiladas, tacos, refried beans, burritos, a salad, strawberries, and milk. He shared his meal with the ministers, who also brought Gray a pizza. After the meal, they gave Gray a Protestant communion. Outside the governor's mansion, many anti-capital punishment activists held a peaceful protest with candles. At 12:01 a.m., the warden escorted Gray to the gas chamber. At 12:08, Gray was strapped to a chair in the chamber. He kept his head bowed and his eyes closed. Occasionally, he would quietly whisper to himself. Though he spoke no last words to the witnesses in the viewing room, he was said to have apologized beforehand for his crimes. At 12:12 a.m., the door to the chamber was sealed. The executioner, T. Barry Bruce, who was also a school custodian, turned the lever of cyanide crystals that would drop into some
Wait,
acid
aren't they
underneath
supposed to
Gray's
be anonymous
chair.
or something?
A white cloud started to rise,
Executioners?
and Gray
I don't know,
appeared to
maybe.
take a deep breath. Shortly after, his head slumped, and he looked to be unconscious. Suddenly, his head jolted back up, and he began having convulsions. There was no head restraint, and as Gray convulsed, he repeatedly slammed his head into a metal pole that was behind his chair, making loud clanging sounds and causing the chamber to vibrate. His face was contorted, and his hands were clenched. Reporters in the viewing room counted each of his gasping moans up to 11. After 8 minutes of this, the warden made everyone leave the viewing room while the horrifying scene went on. As they were exiting, Gray's convulsions continued, and his head turned to the side with his eyes open and rolled back in his head. Doctors who were monitoring his heartbeat the whole time said that Gray was actually dead after 2 minutes and unconscious after 30 seconds. They defended that it was a humane death. They said the convulsions he had were normal for someone dying. Prison officials said Gray died of cardiac arrest at 12:15 a.m. According to the execution log, all movement finally stopped at 12:21 a.m. Gray's attorney, Dennis Balsky, told reporters that Gray had suffered a painful death. Jimmy Lee Gray died banging his head against a steel pole in the gas chamber while reporters counted his moans, said Balsky. There were also reports that the executioner was drunk. This led some to believe the execution was botched. Gray's execution caused a lot of controversy on whether death sentences were humane or not. Mississippi eventually passed a legislation making lethal injection the main method of execution for inmates sentenced after July 1st, 1984. The ministers Jimmy Gray befriended took his remains to their church to bury him and give him a private service. He was 34 years old.
This world is crazy, man.